Dr. Sarah Roberts was a seasoned psychiatrist, having been in practice for more than 10 years. In her office, located in a quiet corner of a busy city, she had encountered all manner of mental health cases, from anxiety and depression to schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder. Her newest patient was a man named Thomas Mills. He was a middle-aged man, ordinary in appearance, who worked as an accountant. From the outside, you'd see nothing unusual. But Thomas claimed he was plagued by hallucinations, ones that filled his every waking moment with terror. These were no ordinary hallucinations, he explained. He saw creatures that no other human being could see, grotesque in form and chilling in their gaze. He described them as lurking in corners, observing him from afar, their bulging eyes filled with a menacing intelligence. Thomas's descriptions were so vivid and detailed that they sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. He spoke of these creatures with such conviction that the line between hallucination and reality seemed to blur. His fear was palpable, infecting the room and seeping into Sarah's thoughts. In the following days, Sarah found her mind returning to Thomas's descriptions. His fears began to invade her mind. The creatures he described seemed to haunt her thoughts. Her cozy, familiar office seemed a little less inviting, shadows cast by her bookcases a little darker. Late one evening, while she was catching up on paperwork, she heard a sound. It was a soft whisper, like a sigh, but there was an undertone to it that made her skin crawl. The room felt chillier. The dim office light seemed to flicker slightly. Turning in her chair, she was paralyzed with a sudden, inexplicable fear. There, in the corner of the room, was a form that was too dark to be just a shadow. It was tall, and its shape seemed to be constantly shifting, like smoke, and it had eyes, bulging, inky eyes just as Thomas had described. With a gasp, Sarah stumbled back from her chair, her heart pounding against her ribs. The shadowy figure seemed to move towards her, its form shifting and twisting. The room was filled with a cold, dread-inducing whispering sound. In a moment of panic, Sarah bolted out of the office, the horrifying whispers echoing behind her. The corridor outside, usually reassuring in its normalcy, now seemed eerily long and deserted. But she didn't stop until she had put a considerable distance between herself and the office. The next day, she found herself sharing her experience with a trusted colleague, Dr. Mark Hastings. Mark was a seasoned psychiatrist as well, a man who prided himself on his rational mind. He listened to Sarah's account with a mix of concern and skepticism. "Sarah," he said finally, "it sounds like stress to me. You've been working too hard. Maybe it's time to take a break." Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that what she had seen was nothing more than a figment of her imagination. But deep down, she knew it was real. She had stepped into Thomas's world, a world where unseen creatures lurked in corners, watching, waiting. In the weeks that followed, Sarah tried to keep her fears at bay. She avoided staying late at the office, and every time she entered her office, she found herself casting a wary glance at the corners. But no matter how hard she tried to deny it, she couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Finally, she decided to share her experience with Thomas. Despite her hesitation, she recounted her encounter, watching his face for signs of disbelief or ridicule. Instead, she found understanding. "They won't harm you, doctor," he said, a strange calmness in his voice that seemed at odds with his usual anxious demeanor. "They're just desperate to be seen, to be acknowledged. They've been unseen, unheard for too long." His words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She was now part of Thomas's reality, sharing in the visions that had been tormenting him. She realized that she had to find a way to cope with these shared hallucinations, to help both Thomas and herself. One late evening, in a desperate attempt to regain control, she decided to confront the figure head-on. Alone in her office, she waited until she could feel the temperature drop, until the whispers were almost deafening. She turned to the corner, looking directly at the swirling darkness, its bulging eyes staring back at her. "I see you," she said, her voice shaking. "I acknowledge your existence. Now leave us be." But the creature didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to grow larger, the whispers intensifying into an ear-splitting cacophony. Fear tightened its grip on Sarah, her heart pounding against her ribs. The figure lunged, and everything went black. The next morning, Sarah's secretary found her unconscious at her desk. The office was freezing cold, and Sarah was deathly pale. Rushed to the hospital, Sarah was diagnosed with a severe panic attack. In the aftermath, Sarah decided to take a leave of absence. She closed down her office and started attending therapy sessions herself. The haunting figure seemed to be tied to her office, and with her staying away, the hallucinations ceased. Months passed before Sarah decided to return to her practice. She was apprehensive as she unlocked her office. Inside, it looked just as she had left it. Everything seemed ordinary until she noticed an unopened letter on her desk. It was a thank you note from Thomas. Sarah froze as she read the note. "Thank you for seeing them, Dr. Roberts," it read. "Thank you for giving them a voice. I don't see them anymore, but I think they're still with you." As Sarah looked up from the letter, the temperature in the room dropped. The whispers started again, soft at first, but growing louder. The hairs on the back of her neck rose as she felt a familiar, dread-filled gaze on her. Though she never saw the creature again, Sarah could always feel it. It was always there, in the corner of her eye, in the chill that pervaded her office, in the whispers that echoed around her. Sarah continued her practice, learning to coexist with the haunting presence. Her encounter with the unseen had forever changed her, turning her office from a place of healing into a chilling realm where realities blurred. Even in the absence of visible terror, the eerie, unsettling presence served as a constant reminder of her uncanny experiences. From then on, patients often reported a sense of unease in her office, an inexplicable chill, and soft whispers that they couldn't quite understand. Though they dismissed these as figments of their imagination, Sarah knew better. She had given voice to the unseen, and now they were a part of her reality.
Daniel Wells had always been a night owl, but not by choice. Recently, the darkness wasn't a blanket of peace, rather a curtain of terror. His sleep was stolen by nightmares, grotesque visions that clung to his mind even in the light of day. They were vivid, hauntingly real, and left him soaked in a cold sweat. These weren't ordinary nightmares either. They were dark corridors of his fears, twisted into monstrous forms, terrorizing his slumber. The dread they instilled gripped his waking hours too, keeping him on a constant edge, his nerves frayed. His nights were battles, and his days were about nursing the wounds of the war from the night before. Daniel was a writer, a weaver of tales, but now, his own mind had become a story he couldn't decipher. He loved to dive deep into the minds of his characters, unravel their fears, their dreams, but these nightmares, they were beyond his understanding, and they were breaking him. His anxiety was now a shadow that refused to part. It clouded his thoughts, crippled his creativity, leaving his pages hauntingly empty. His successful career, built on bestsellers, now seemed a distant memory. He longed for the times when his mind was a canvas of colorful ideas, not the jumbled mess of haunting images it had become. In his desperation to reclaim his life, Daniel decided to seek professional help. He needed someone who could venture into the storm within his mind and bring back calm. And so he turned to the most reputed psychiatric clinic in London, housed in a charming Victorian-era building. The clinic had a long history of success stories, a beacon of hope for those wrestling with their minds. But little did Daniel know, this decision would not bring the solace he sought. Instead, it would lead him down a path darker than his worst nightmares. As Daniel Wells stepped out of the cab, he took a moment to admire the imposing structure that stood before him. It was a grand Victorian-era building, with turrets reaching out to the grey London sky and ivy clinging to the brickwork, adding to its antiquated charm. Yet beneath its allure, there was something unsettling about the clinic. He checked his watch. It was just past 2 in the afternoon. The clinic stood tall and silent, its quietness disrupted only by the occasional gust of wind rustling through the leafless trees nearby. It seemed like a silent spectre, a world apart from the bustling city it resided in. Taking a deep breath to steel his nerves, Daniel approached the heavy wooden door. A signboard read, "Hartley Psychiatric Clinic." He pushed the door open, and a musty smell greeted him, the scent of old books mixed with a faint medicinal odor. The floor creaked under his weight, as if whispering secrets of the countless troubled souls it had witnessed. He found himself in a spacious lobby, its grandeur slightly marred by the dim lighting. An enormous chandelier hung from the high ceiling, its crystals covered in a thin layer of dust. Victorian-style furniture adorned the room, and haunting portraits stared from the walls, their eyes seeming to follow Daniel as he walked towards the reception desk. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, greeted him with a polite smile. "Mr. Wells?" she inquired, to which Daniel nodded. As he filled out his paperwork, he took in the uncanny quietness. The only sounds were the distant tick-tock of an old grandfather clock and the faint scratch of his pen on paper. His heart pounded in his chest. The aura of the place, its eerie calm, was far from comforting, but he was here now. Turning in his paperwork, he took one last look around the haunted sanctuary that was supposed to help him. Shaking off the creeping unease, he told himself that he was here for a reason, to seek help, to regain control, to stop the nightmares. Little did he know, the real nightmare was just beginning. Daniel sat in the waiting room, nervously tapping his foot against the polished, aged floor. The clinic was silent, save for the soft ticking of an old wall clock, amplifying the quiet hum of his anticipation. Portraits of past doctors stared down at him from the walls, their gazes as cold and immovable as stone. After what felt like an eternity, the secretary, a polite woman with a warm smile, ushered him into Dr. Hartley's office. It was a large room, adorned with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with medical textbooks and psychological literature. The smell of aged paper and worn-out leather furniture filled the room, adding to the sense of antiquity. There, behind a heavy wooden desk, sat Dr. Victor Hartley. He was an imposing figure, with sharp features and penetrating grey eyes that seemed to peer right into Daniel's soul. His salt and pepper hair was meticulously groomed, and his attire reflected an old-world charm. He stood, offering a firm handshake and a professional yet warm smile. "Welcome, Mr. Wells," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "I've been looking forward to our session." As their session began, Dr. Hartley displayed an aura of empathy that quickly eased Daniel's initial apprehension. They discussed Daniel's condition, his nightmares, his fears, and his hopes. The doctor listened with unwavering attention, nodding occasionally, and making notes in a leather-bound journal. Every so often he would ask a question, guiding the conversation deeper into Daniel's psyche. There was something comforting about his steady demeanor, and Daniel found himself opening up more than he had expected. However, beneath the soothing reassurance of Dr. Hartley's words, Daniel could not entirely shake off a fleeting sense of unease. There was something about the doctor's penetrating gaze, the way he studied him intently, that left him feeling slightly exposed. As the session concluded, Daniel felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. Yes, Dr. Hartley seemed professional and kind, but the glimmer of something inscrutable in his eyes made Daniel feel unsettled. The writer left the office with a flutter of hope in his chest, yet a small, persistent knot of fear continued to tug at his nerves. At the start of the therapy, Daniel had held on to hope like a fragile lifeline. He believed in Dr. Hartley's wisdom, his confident smiles, and the promise of peace that those therapy sessions held. But as days turned into weeks, Daniel found himself spiraling further into his nightmares rather than escaping them. His nights were restless, filled with chilling dreams that left him waking up in cold sweat, his heart pounding like a trapped bird against his ribs. His dreams were no longer just shadows of fear. They had transformed into vivid, terrifying journeys. There were monstrous figures chasing him through endless corridors, or he was sinking into a dark sea, struggling to breathe. Every night, a new terror awaited him, keeping him from the sweet escape of peaceful sleep. Daytime wasn't kinder either. His anxiety was no longer a distant hum in the back of his mind. It was now a roaring storm. It rushed through his veins, made his hands shake, and clouded his mind until he felt like he was standing on the edge of a terrifying abyss. Simple tasks had turned into monumental challenges. He couldn't focus on his writing. The words blurring on the page, his thoughts scattered. Daniel began to voice his concerns to Dr. Hartley. In the hushed confines of the therapy room, he confessed, "I'm feeling worse, doctor. The nightmares, they're more real than ever." Dr. Hartley, sitting across from him, maintained his composed demeanor. He merely adjusted his glasses and said, "This is part of the process, Daniel. Sometimes it gets worse before it gets better." Something in the way Dr. Hartley spoke, a flicker of something dark in his eyes, gave Daniel pause. The therapy room felt colder, the silence heavier. An uneasy feeling stirred within him, casting a shadow over his once bright hope. But he chose to push his doubts away. After all, wasn't this part of healing, a little pain before the cure? The next night, Daniel awoke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, his eyes darting around the room. Another nightmare. But this one was different. It was more intense and seemed almost too real. He could still feel the icy breath of the monstrous figure that had been chasing him, hear its hollow voice echoing in his mind. His anxiety bubbled up, a knot tightening in his stomach. The clinic was unusually quiet at dawn. The Victorian architecture, charming in daylight, now cast eerie shadows that danced in the dim light. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of the wind outside seemed to whisper sinister secrets. As he walked down the hallway towards Dr. Hartley's office for his early morning session, he felt a chill run down his spine. The portraits lining the walls seemed to watch him with lifeless eyes, adding to his mounting unease. Dr. Hartley greeted him with his usual professional smile, motioning for Daniel to take his regular seat. As Daniel sat, he studied the doctor. Dr. Hartley's silver hair was neatly combed back, his glasses reflecting the faint light in the room. His demeanor was calm and assured, but Daniel couldn't help but feel a hint of coldness in his eyes, something he hadn't noticed before. The session began as it always did, with Dr. Hartley's seemingly innocuous questions. What did you dream about? How did it make you feel? But today Daniel found himself hesitating, a nagging feeling tugging at his thoughts. He wondered if there was more behind these questions. Could his worsening condition be linked to these sessions? As the session continued, he began noticing oddities about Dr. Hartley's reactions. Was that a flicker of satisfaction when he mentioned the intensity of his nightmares? Did his eyes sparkle when he spoke about his heightened anxiety? Leaving the session, Daniel felt a surge of dread. The walls of the clinic, once a refuge, now felt oppressive, closing in on him. Was Dr. Hartley really trying to help him, or was there something more sinister at play? He shook his head, pushing away the creeping doubts, but the seed of suspicion had been sown. The following week, Daniel sat across from Dr. Hartley, his hands tightly clenched. They had been sitting in the usual room, its Victorian elegance doing little to soothe Daniel's mounting dread. Today's session felt different. It was colder, the room's darkness somehow deeper, and a tension clung to the air like a static charge. The doctor was acting strange, his calm exterior bearing subtle cracks. As Dr. Hartley spoke, his voice was steady. Tell me, Daniel. Describe the feeling of fear. Does it have a taste, a sound? Daniel hesitated. Why would he ask that? He felt a prick of unease but tried to brush it away. It tastes bitter, like cold black coffee, Daniel finally answered. His voice trembled slightly, and the sound a high-pitched ring. A strange glint flickered in Dr. Hartley's eyes. It was a look that seemed almost excited, thrilled. It was out of place, it was wrong. Interesting, Dr. Hartley replied, scribbling something down in his notebook. His tone was unusually enthusiastic. His pen moved too eagerly across the page. And the nightmares, they are getting worse, aren't they? Daniel nodded. His heart pounded harder against his chest. Why are you asking these questions? Dr. Hartley didn't answer. He only watched Daniel, an unsettling smile played on his lips. The feeling of dread began to grip Daniel tighter. The cold, the darkness, the strange questions, they all began to make sense. It was in that moment, a horrific truth dawned on him. He was not getting better. He was being pushed into a deeper abyss. His trust began to shatter, replaced by an icy fear. His doctor, the one supposed to guide him out of his mental turmoil, was the one leading him deeper into it. A sinister fascination underpinned Dr. Hartley's therapy, and Daniel was his unwilling subject. The session ended, but the echo of Dr. Hartley's chilling words remained. As Daniel left the room, his mind echoed with the realization of his psychiatrist's dark intentions, and he felt an insidious chill creep down his spine. His nightmares weren't his enemy, his doctor was. Daniel had just endured another grueling therapy session with Dr. Hartley. His heart pounded in his chest as he walked the dimly lit hallway back to his room, his mind a whirlwind of fear and doubt. The nightmares had worsened, the clinic's hushed silence seemed to scream at him, and the doctor's methods felt increasingly tormenting. When he reached his room, he found an envelope lying on his bed, addressed to him in Dr. Hartley's sharp handwriting. With trembling hands, he opened it, expecting another set of strange exercises. But what he found inside was far more terrifying. It was a transcript, a detailed account of his nightmares he never verbally shared in detail. It also included commentary by Dr. Hartley. His blood ran cold as he read through the horrifying details. The transcript was a mirror to his nightmares, but with an unsettling addition: predictions of new fears that had only started appearing in his dreams after he'd read the transcript. He felt sick, realizing that his worsening condition was not a symptom, but a result of the doctor's intervention. Panic set in as he tried to make sense of the documents. He had trusted Dr. Hartley with his fears, and now he felt betrayed and manipulated. He flipped through the pages, his eyes wide with horror as he read the doctor's cold analysis of his escalating fear, his perverse enjoyment of the process clearly evident. The gravity of his situation hit him hard. Dr. Hartley wasn't trying to help him, he was toying with his mind, amplifying his fear for his own twisted amusement. The doctor he had trusted was the monster feeding his nightmares. Determined, Daniel knew what he had to do. The evidence was right there in his hands, the horrifying truth staring back at him. He must confront Dr. Hartley and escape this tormenting nightmare of a clinic. His fear now morphed into a resolve as he braced himself for the inevitable confrontation. It was time to unmask the monster hiding in plain sight. Another week had passed and Daniel sat in the familiar leather chair of Dr. Hartley's office, his hands sweaty, his heart pounding like a drum. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of the antique clock on the wall, each tick echoing his escalating fear. Across from him, Dr. Hartley sat in his usual spot, calm and composed, but his eyes held a new, chilling light. A hint of dark fascination glimmered behind his thick glasses, making Daniel's stomach churn with dread. "Dr. Hartley," Daniel started, his voice trembling, "I believe you've been manipulating my fears, worsening my condition on purpose." He watched the doctor, looking for any sign of guilt. Dr. Hartley's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair. "Daniel," he began in his smooth, professional voice, "why would you think that? You're in a fragile state. Your mind is playing tricks on you." His denial was as smooth as silk, but Daniel had expected it. He'd seen the evidence. He knew the truth. He couldn't let his fear dictate his actions now. "No," Daniel said, his voice stronger. "I found your notes, your twisted experiments. I'm not just another patient to you. I'm a guinea pig for your sick fascination." Dr. Hartley's calm exterior finally cracked. His surprise turned into an unsettling smile. "Very perceptive, Daniel. I underestimated you," he confessed, leaning forward, his gaze fixed on Daniel. "Yes, I've been studying you, your fears. It's fascinating, don't you see?" The admission sent a chill down Daniel's spine, confirming his darkest suspicions. But he wasn't going to be a victim any longer. His fear, his nightmare, was now his weapon. He had to fight. His eyes met Dr. Hartley's. "I won't let you continue this," he said firmly. The office was no longer just a room. It was a battlefield, the air heavy with tension. The confrontation had just begun. The night cloaked the clinic in darkness, a perfect mirror to Daniel's gloom-ridden mind. His plan weighed heavily on him, a bundle of nerves in his stomach. This was his only chance at freedom. He stood up, his heart beating wildly in his chest. Every creak of the clinic seemed to echo around him, a harsh reminder of the danger lurking in the shadows. He turned the doorknob slowly, his hand shaking. The door swung open with a soft creak, sending a wave of panic through Daniel. He froze, waiting. When no footsteps approached, he stepped out into the corridor. The hallway was a maze of darkness, the only light emanating from the slivers beneath the other patients' doors. His pulse throbbed in his ears as he moved silently, like a ghost, past the other rooms. His destination, the records room. Dr. Hartley's hideous secret needed to be exposed, and proof of his twisted practice was essential. Each step took him closer to his goal as he pushed through the fear of being caught. With a final glance down the hallway, he opened the records room door. The room was awash with moonlight, casting long, eerie shadows. He rifled through the cabinets, his hands trembling as he found his own file. His heart nearly leapt out of his chest as he read the detailed notes. The evidence of Dr. Hartley's manipulation spelled out in chilling clarity. Stuffing the file into his bag, he knew it was time to leave. Now. His return to the corridor was met with a deafening silence. It was the calm before the storm, and he knew it. With each step towards the exit, his heartbeat quickened, his breath shallow. Freedom was so close he could almost taste it. The exit door loomed ahead. With a final surge of adrenaline, he pushed it open and stumbled into the cool night air. The taste of freedom was sweet, yet tinged with the bitter reality of his horrifying ordeal. He didn't stop running until the clinic was just a dark speck in the distance. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath ragged. The biting chill of the London air offered an oddly comforting reality check. Safe in his apartment, Daniel pondered his next move. He knew he couldn't let Dr. Hartley continue his horrific practices. A realization dawned. He would use his writing, his most powerful tool, to expose Dr. Hartley's atrocities. With newfound determination, Daniel began to write his experiences. His words spilled onto the pages, unfiltered, raw, painting a vivid, horrifying picture of Dr. Hartley's manipulation and the torment he had endured. Once finished, he contacted the local newspaper, known for its investigative journalism. Daniel had often dreamt of his stories being featured there, but never under such circumstances. The reporter was immediately intrigued by the chilling narrative, promising to verify the facts and bring the story to light. The newspaper launched an investigation, unearthing similar complaints from past patients. The story made headlines, exposing Dr. Hartley's misconduct and leading to his immediate suspension. The ripples were wide and profound. The clinic's reputation crumbled, and the medical community was shaken to its core. As Daniel watched the fallout, he felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering dread. The clinic was a haunted house of hidden horrors, a place that had once promised healing but delivered only harm. Dr. Hartley, once a trusted figure, had turned his vulnerability into a playground for his twisted experiments. This experience had taught Daniel a harsh lesson about trust and the fragility of the human mind. It was a reminder that the mind, in all its complexity, could be a beautiful tapestry of thoughts and dreams, but also a delicate fabric susceptible to manipulation. Now, Daniel found solace in his writing. It became a catharsis, a means to reclaim his life and sanity. His words not only exposed a monster, but also highlighted the fragility and strength of the human spirit. He hoped his story would serve as a beacon, a warning to others about the horrors that could lurk in the most unexpected places. As he wrote the last words of his experience, Daniel looked out of his window. The sky was turning grey, hinting at an approaching storm. It was much like the human mind, he thought. Peaceful one moment, stormy the next, and always beautifully fragile.